Let's start talking about memory storage today. We moved on from encoding, and in the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, the next process we should talk about is memory storage. So we're going to review some of the storage stages that we've talked about before. Remember, the first stage in the Atkinson-Shiffrin model really is sensory memory. And remember, this is where our memory acts as a filter of all incoming information from our senses. Selective attention allows certain information to be passed into short-term memory for further processing. And sensory memory really is an important filtering process. Attention is what allows information through that filter. Information that is relevant to us, which means important, we notice and we pay attention to. Information that is unusual or unexpected is easily noticeable. And information or experiences or environmental factors that are familiar to us grab our attention the easiest. Other non-intended information really is gone. It's very fleeting in our memory, which means lasting only for a brief moment. So over here, you can see that when information comes in from our eyes, ears, our sense of touch, smell, or taste, the sensory memory buffers and filters out most of it, and only that information that is relevant, unusual, or familiar kind of busts through and gets into the short-term memory system. Now, there are specific types of sensory memory. They do act as slightly different buffering systems. Iconic sensory memory is fleeting filter of incoming visual information. It lasts less than a second, really only at about a 20th or a 30th of a second. Echoic sensory memory is fleeting auditory memory. This is our perfect memory for sounds and things that were said to us. And it lasts a little bit longer, 3 or 4 seconds. So when you're trying to watch that Netflix episode and mom or dad is trying to get your attention and they're saying, hey, and you're like, what? And you're accused of not listening. And you say, yes, I am. And then they ask you, well, what did I say? And you're like, and you think about it, and then you find it a second or two later. That would be echoic memory. Now, if incoming stimuli is attended to, it's going to be transferred to short-term memory. So if we look over here at this little diagram, remember our iconic memory is really a brief eidetic memory or a perfectly detailed photographic picture memory of what just happened. Because it takes our brain a little while to process visual information, and then it's kind of like a windshield wiper washes off or wipes off the image, and the next image replaces it. So iconic memory really can only last for that fleeting brief moment and has to be replaced constantly. Echoic memory, not necessary to replace it constantly in order to adapt to our environment. Remember, all other information is quickly forgotten if not attended to. Now, if information gets through our sensory memory and we do pay attention right here, information can get into the short-term memory, which is really just a temporary holding place so we can process information. It has a very limited capacity and duration. 2 words that you should really pay attention to and be able to use in explanations of the memory system. Capacity is how much information we can hold, and duration would be how long we can hold it. And unless that information that gets into short-term memory is used, it doesn't last very long, longer than sensory memory. Peterson in 1959 discovered the duration of sensory memory really is only about 20 to 30 seconds. And they created a simple experiment where they had different numbers on note cards. They would flash a note card with, say, a number 58621, and immediately after they put down the card, they would say a number like 713, and the subject had to count backwards by 3 from that number until the experimenter said recall. So if they showed 58621, and then they would say 713, the subject would have to count backwards 710, 707, 704, etc. And then 10, 20, 30 seconds later, the subjects are asked to recall. After about 20 or 30 seconds, people were unable to recall the numbers, maybe one or two of them. So Peterson and Peterson identified 20 to 30 seconds without rehearsal seems to be the duration of a short-term memory. Now you may have heard of the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. This represents the capacity of unrelated information in the short-term memory system. This was discovered by Miller in 1956. We will experiment with your short-term memory so you can experience what it's like to try to hold more bits of information in your memory. Remember, this is unrelated bits, so you can have information about your friends and information about school and information maybe about what you have to do after school can be juggled separately. Now, our short-term memory is better for random numbers than random letters. Why do you think so? I may ask you this question tomorrow. Now, the working memory function, remember, this is a more complex system. This is where information comes in from the sensory memory and then is manipulated and evaluated, and decisions are made in this system, which is part of the short-term memory system. So it consists of a central executive. This is really the brains behind what you choose to pay attention to, how you think about information, and what you use to sort through your problems. There's two subsystems in here, the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. The phonological loop really deals with remembering spoken language. It's your inner voice, so you can think about what somebody is saying to you. And the visual spatial sketchpad stores and processes visual info in the visual or spatial form that it was received. So we can recreate a map or a diagram or what somebody looked like that we just met. The central executive is like the boss. It determines what you pay attention to. And information comes into the working memory from sensory memory and long-term memory. So what you're experiencing and you pay attention to can cause information to be retrieved, familiar information to be retrieved from long-term memory. You then use that information, the new information from sensory memory and the old information from long-term memory to solve everyday problems. You analyze information. You can juggle mental tasks. You can keep focus on something. And you can integrate, bring together information. You can expand your knowledge by elaborating. And you decide and make plans in this system. So every conscious thought that you have is based on your working memory using new and old information together. Now, long-term memory, remember, is virtually limitless in duration. It might last over 100 years. I remember my grandfather, who lived to be over 100 years old, would tell me stories about how he remembered seeing his first car ever, and those memories were over 90 years old. So we may not have a duration limit. There's really two systems that work here, the hippocampus and the cerebellum. Very important that you know the location of each of these, and very important that you can distinguish between each and explain how they both work together to create your long-term memory. We'll talk about explicit memory first. Explicit memory, look at that EXPL. Explicit memory is long-term memory for explainable things. So explicit memory is explainable. You can talk to somebody about it. It deals with episodic memories or experiences in your life. Your 10th birthday, your first day of freshman year in high school, your first crush cutie kiss if you've had one, or that kiss from an aunt that you didn't like because she slobbers on your cheek. It's also known by nickname as declarative memory. The word declarative is an older term that refers to information that you can talk about, state, or declare. These are things like facts that you know, like who's the first president of the United States, when did World War II begin, general knowledge about how the world works, gravity and time, and personal experiences, stories that you can relive. The hippocampus seems to be a primary location of the brain in which these memories are formed. It means, hippocampus really means seahorse. And if you see this picture here, the hippocampus, when removed from the brain, resembles a seahorse. It is in the center of the brain in the limbic system. So if this brain's looking up to the left, this is the back of the brain. You'll notice the hippocampus is down inside in the middle of that brain. And there's two sides, okay? So there's a left hemisphere hippocampus and a right hemisphere hippocampus. And there's heavy activity when forming a new memory in the hippocampus. So if we get a good look here, notice the cerebellum that we talked about is behind and below the brain, and the hippocampus is structured deep inside the brain. So again, to continue with explicit memory, I'm going to show you a really brief explanation about what the hippocampus does. This professor is giving a little brief description, and it's kind of entertaining, so let's take a look.
There's a very famous patient by the name of HM. Some of you may have heard of HM. HM had epilepsy, and so in the early 50s, he was going to have to go and get his brain resected because it was now life-threatening, his epilepsy, and so they pulled out. When they did the surgery, they were doing an experimental surgery. They had the unfortunate incident of taking out the hippocampus and some ancillary parts of this guy's brain. When the HM wakes up, he has no ability to convert short-term memory into long-term memory. So he can meet you, and 2 hours later, meet you again, and meet you again forever. It's Groundhog Day for HM. There is no ability to know. He has anterograde amnesia. Can't go forward with it. But here's the extraordinary thing about HM that was discovered that led us to the path that it took years to consolidate a memory. They began asking him, they knew he didn't have any short-term memory in the forward direction. What about retrograde? What about going the other direction? What did he begin to forget? And they would ask him questions of things that happened a year ago. And you know what was extraordinary is he didn't know either. He didn't have a hippocampus, but that was weird. The hippocampus converting short-term to long-term? Not. 2 years. Nope, couldn't remember anything. 3 years. No memory. 5 years. 7 years. 11 years, he finally got a memory trace back. And then after 11 years, he could remember a lot of different things about what was going on. And all of a sudden, it began to hit researchers. Oh my gosh, the hippocampus is not only involved in the conversion of short-term memory to long-term memory, it's also involved in systems consolidation. And it took 11 years to get it fully consolidated. The hippocampus was needed for 11 years with HM for certain types of memory. After the 11th year, forget it. It was somewhere else. The nomad had finally settled down, and it didn't involve the hippocampus. Now we know what goes on. When a memory recruited for long-term storage, it will now go in, and the hippocampus will get a hold of it, and it will be an association between the surface of the brain, which is the cortex, and the hippocampus, and they form a love relationship that lasts a decade, maybe more. Nomadic now, it's whatever it's doing something. And then, after the 10th year, maybe for HM, it's different years for different people. All of a sudden, for some reason, the hippocampus says, you know, I'm done with you. We're getting a divorce. I don't need this surface anymore. And it subtracts its information, subtracts the electrical relationship, but it's no longer needed because it's still in the cortex, and now this is your permanent memory. I told you there was no such thing as a hard drive in the brain, and there really isn't. It's kind of scattered all over the place. But it forms this electrical relationship years. If it takes years to consolidate a memory till its final form, it means stuff that you learned in the first grade will not be fully systems consolidated until you are a sophomore in high school.
Okay, a very interesting description. I hope that was entertaining for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about the physical trace of memory in an upcoming video, okay? With explicit memory, term infantile amnesia is an interesting concept to identify. It's understood that the hippocampus is not fully wired into our brain until we're 3 or 4 years old. While it exists in the young brain, it doesn't seem to have fully connected to the rest of the brain until 3 or 4 years old, which means reliable memories prior to this age are not likely real. It might even be the result of source amnesia, or you remembering other people's stories or pictures or videos that you saw of the event. A little bit more about the hippocampus. Remember, we said it is lateralized. There are two halves, so if this brain is looking down towards the lower left, backside is to the upper right. There are two structures, one in each hemisphere. Damage to the left side would cause trouble with remembering new verbal information, okay with spatial and visual information. Right side damage would be the opposite. We'd have problems with visual spatial information, but not language. Now the implicit memory, as we finish up here, implicit memory is for a memory for procedures. So it is often referred to as procedural memory. These are physical things that we can do, like talk, walk, and write. These deal with physical skills and conditioned responses, which we'll talk about at a later date. Implicit memories require fewer cortical connections than does the hippocampus, so it's not as densely packed with neurons. Damage to the cerebellum would cause difficulty being conditioned or habitual learning habits, and learning procedural skills like fine motor skills. Remember, the cerebellum is in the back, lower part of the brain. The eyes would be up to the left, the back of the head here to the right. So the cerebellum is a structure in the back, lower back of the brain. Damage to the hippocampus doesn't necessarily interfere with learning new physical skills, but you might forget you learned them because the hippocampus would damage explicit memory, so the memory for learning something new. And there is evidence for dual systems, these two systems. Ledoux in 1996, working with amnesia patients, they continuously introduce themselves to the physician as if meeting themselves for the first time, just like the description in HM. You could meet him and then 10 minutes later meet him again and they wouldn't know that you had met before. They did the little trick by the physician placed a thumbtack in their hand and they shook hands with the subject, and then later on the patient won't shake hands with the physician but can't explain why. So they had no explicit memory of having met the person before and having had the thumbtack trick played on them in the handshake, but they had damage to their hippocampus because they couldn't remember the handshake. Also, golfers with amnesia, they didn't forget if they had damage to the hippocampus. They didn't forget how to swing a golf club or play golf. They could hit the ball, they could use the right club, but they often forgot that they already hit the driver, so they would tee up a second ball and hit it again. They might forget that they haven't putted yet and walk off the green without putting. So they didn't forget the how-to, but they did forget the what about golf. In our next video, we will talk about physical storage of memory. Where does a memory actually reside? And we're looking for the engram, which refers to the physical trace. And we're going to focus on the space between neurons in our next video. So that's it. Remember, review and quiz yourself, and we will talk tomorrow.